validation is failing. Can't hold it much longer. Think! Bubbles, I'm a genius. We did it! Backend is secure. What is up, everyone, and welcome to Hello World Episode 14, Sign Up Form Backend Validation. As with every video, we are implementing a new feature in our Hello World app, so if there's something you would like to see coded up and implemented, let me know in the comments down below. In our last episode, we created our Hello World database and set up our users table, and in the users table, we added all the columns we need to collect the user's data from the sign up form. In episode 12, we created our front-end validation for our sign up form, where when we click the sign up button, we use JavaScript to validate each of the input fields. If you missed the front-end validation, if you missed the creating of the database, go ahead and check those episodes out in my Hello World playlist. Now in this video, with our sign-up form and the front-end validation setup, along with our database setup, we're going to go ahead and pass the data from the sign-up form to the backend and validate it on our server with PHP. Let's get into the episode. We're going to go ahead and open up our Hello World repository in our text editor. The Hello World repository is on GitHub. Go check it out, github.com/jstolpe/hello world. Link will be in the description. We're going to head over to our app.js signup script.js. This is where we left off at the end of our front-end validation episode. We created our form helper JavaScript object in JS form helper script.js, and we're using this object to validate everything on our signup form. When the user clicks our button signup, we call our server signup, pass along that form object, and we call the .validate on it. Now for this video, we're going to be working inside of our if statement here. When the signup form is validated by the front end, we need to pass it along to the back end. Now to send the data to the server, we need to create an ajax call, and we're going to create that ajax call function in our global templates default script.js. This gets included on every page, so we'll always have access to our ajax call. Here we have our global hello world object, and inside of our global hello world object, we're going to create a new function called ajax. And our ajax function will take in a params object. These will be the settings for our XML HTTP request, which we're going to define right here. This request variable right here will be handling our request to the server. Then we're going to specify our parameters. We're going to initialize it to an empty string because we might not have any that we need to send along with the request we're making. Then we're going to do a request.open. And the first parameter here is our type. So we're going to get this from the parameters that we're passing in, which we're going to pass over here in our signup script. So if our form is valid, we're going to declare our object here, hello world. And to call our ajax function, all we have to do is a .ajax on it. And here is where we're passing in our parameters, right into our ajax function. The first thing we're going to specify is our type, and this is going to be a post request. Now the type of post here will be our first parameter in our open function. After the type comes the URL. This is the URL we want to hit for the request. And we're also making this a variable in our params object, so we have to define it over here. URL. Here we're specifying the path to our website, the controller we want to hit, and the function within that controller that we want to hit. In our case, we want to pass along the signup form data to our Hello World signup controller and the user function within our signup controller. Open up our signup controller, and let's create a user function here. And just to verify that the data is coming from the front end and making it to our user function, we're going to print out everything in our post data, which comes through in our underscore post variable in PHP. With our URL specified, we need to pass along the actual data we want, which is the signup form data. So the next parameter is going to be data, and this is going to be an object, and we can pass along any key value pairs we want here. We're going to pass along our form data to the form data key. Form data, and now here's where we are going to pass along our signup form data. We're going to say signup.getPost data. Now, since this is the first time we are getting post data from our form helper object we created in the validation episode, we need to create our getPost data function inside of our form helper script, which is an assets.js form helper script.js. In here, we're going to create our form helper getPost data. We're going to do a getSelf here equals this, and all this function needs to do is JSON stringify our entire form helper object so we can pass it along in our post data. And to do that, we just call json.stringify on our entire object. And this is what will be placed over here in our form data key right here, getPost data. Back to our ajax function that we are writing. We are on our request.open. The last parameter here we specify to true, and then we have to set our request headers. And here we need to make sure we specify the content type to be form URL encode, just like if it was actually being posted from an actual form element in HTML. Then we're going to set up our ready state function. This is the function that will fire off when we get a response back from our server. Here we're going to check our request.state. We're going to make sure that that equals 4. 4 means that the request is done. Then we're going to check our request status. And we're going to make sure that this equals 200. 200 is good. If our request is done and it's good, then we're going to call our params.success function. Here is our request.response text. That's the response we got back from the server. We're going to JSON parse that and pass it along to our success function in our parameters. Over in our signup script.js, we're going to define our success function. And so this data here coming into our success function is our JSON request response text right here. So our success function fires off, and now we can do whatever we want inside of our success function with our response data from the server. Now that our success function is all set up, we're going to go ahead and set up our send params string. So here we're looping over our data from the params that we passed in right here, data, form data. And we can append on other things here. We could say hello world. So the property here would be the key, form data, hello, as it loops over each one of them. Then we're appending on to our send param string property, which would be the key name, our form data, equals, then we're going to encode that value for that property, which would be our signup form get post data, and then here would be our world. And we need to do this so that special characters don't mess up the URL as it's getting passed along. Lastly, we add on the ampersand, and that signifies the end of that key value pair in the URL. Then we can fire off our .send, and we pass along our send params right into our send function. Now the request is going to fire off, and then when it comes back, it's going to fire off our success function right here, and that will pass our response text back here to our success function, and then we can do whatever we want with the data that we get back right here. So right here is a good place to test to make sure that things are actually working, and we want to make sure that our signup form get post data has been passed along to our endpoint hello world signup user over here in our signup function. In our network tab in our browser, we should see our post response being dumped out onto the page. Let's refresh our signup page and fill out the form. Our signup form has been filled out. We're going to hit the F12 button. Under our network tab here, we should see a new call going to our server. Click on that, and we can see the endpoint we hit, localhost hello world signup user. That's our controller and our user function. Then under the requests tab, we can see what was passed along to that endpoint. Here's our parameters. We have our form data, JSON encoded from our front-end form helper, the get post data. Then we have our hello world key value there. And under our response tab is where we should see the server side. Here we have dumped out in our users function the post data. We have our form data here, nicely JSON encoded for us, and our hello world key value pair, which is happening right here when we print out our post variable. Now we need to validate this data on the server side, and we need to return that to the front end. First off, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get our form data. Since our form data here is JSON encoded, we need to JSON decode it with a boolean of true. That way we get a nice PHP array instead of a JSON string. Now if we print out our form data here, we should see a nice PHP array over here in the response instead of a long JSON string like this. Now on our front end, we'll just click the sign up button again. There is no need to reload the page because we have made the edits. Only edits we have made are server side. Now the call will go off to the server, but this time it will run our updated code snippet here. We click sign up, click on the response, and now we have a nice PHP array instead of a JSON encoded string. So what we have done here is we've taken our front end JavaScript object, we've encoded it, sent it to the server, and we've JSON decoded it to get it into a nice PHP array. So what we're seeing right here is a PHP array of our JavaScript form object. Next, we're going to call our signup model user. We're going to create a user function in there, and our user function here is going to return our form data, but it's going to return our form data validated. That way, if anybody bypasses our front-end validation checks and the form data actually comes through with bad form data, the PHP will catch it. So we're going to update our form data with what's returned from our user function here, and then to pass it back to the front end, we have to JSON encode it. So now our form data will run through our user validation on the back end, and it will update our form data variable here, and we're going to re-encode it for the front end. Over in our app models, we're going to create a new model here called signup model. Open up our signup model, and we're going to create our user function. Parameter coming in here is our form data, JSON decoded as a nice PHP array. Then the first thing we want to do is validate our signup form. And we're going to pass along all our form data. Right under our user function is where we'll define our validate signup form function. We have our parameter there of form data. Now on our validate signup form function, what we want to do is validate each one of the inputs from the signup form. We'll begin with our email input. And into our validate function, we're going to pass along the email object from our form elements object. Copy this function and create our validate form user's email right here. And we'll call our parameter form element. It'll be an array, and we're going to modify it, so we're going to pass it by reference. The first thing we need to do for validating our email address is make sure a user does not already exist in our database with that email address. To get a current user's info with email address from the database, we need to set up our users model. Over in our models, we're going to create a users model. Open that up, and the first function we're going to create is getUser with column value. So we're going to pass in a column and a value. Over in our database users table, the column refers to the column name here, and then the value would be the value of that column. We're going to begin with our select statement, and we're just going to select star from the users table. Then we have to specify the database and the table name. We're going to define our table name up here as a constant table name. Now we just call self table name, which is users. Then we need to specify our where clause. And this will be users, the users table, dot, and the column name passed in. And the second parameter for the where is the value. So we're searching the users table for whatever column name we want and whatever value is in that column, and we'll return that row. Then we're going to specify the type of array we want to get back. Here we just want to get back one row from the table, so we're going to do single. And then we're going to get our data, user info. This call right here, run select query, runs our select query with all of the other options we have set for our database. And then we can return our user info. We're going to define another constant here for our column name email. And just like the table name, we will be using these column names throughout the code. So we're going to set it to a variable. That way, if we ever change this column for whatever reason, all we have to do is update this constant, and it will update everywhere else throughout the code base wherever this constant is used. So we specify our users model constant, which will be email column, and then the value for that column. So what we're trying to do here is get a row from the database. The column is email, and the value is hello@world.com. So the idea here is to check to see if we have this user's info with email. If a user already exists in the database with that email when he's just trying to sign up, that means we have to mark it as invalid. Form elements coming in, the isValue key, we're going to set that to false. So the front end might have validated it because it was a valid email address, a structure at least, but the front end doesn't know if there's already a user in the database. So it passes it to the back end, and now the email is marked as invalid. Else, we're going to mark it as true. We want to also validate the back end to make sure that the email structure is correct. So we're going to create a form helper. We're going to pass along the email from the form to our form helper is valid email. And if it's not a valid email address, meaning the structure doesn't check out, we will also mark it as false on the back end. Over in our models, we're going to create a form helper model. Open that up. And in our form helper model, we have to define our isValidEmail function. Parameter coming in is an email address, and then we're going to use the PHP filter var to validate our email address. Now we will get a boolean saying if whatever email coming in is true or false. If a user exists in the database already with the email you're trying to sign up with, or if the email address you're trying to sign up with is not a valid email address, meaning the structure is invalid, we will set the form element is valid to false. Otherwise, we're going to set it to true. Now in case it's false, we need to specify the error message. Over in our form helper, we're going to store the error messages. So for this message, we're going to create a key called email invalid, and then set our message. Back in our signup model, we're going to update our form element message. And this is going to be based on our isValid flag. If the email is valid, the message will be empty. Otherwise, we're going to specify our form helper model messages email invalid. And that is our validate form uses email on the back end in our validate signup form function. Now we need to go ahead and write validate functions for each of the other input fields. The next input field is our username. We're going to pass our form elements username and then define our username function. We're going to do something very similar to our validate email function. We're going to call user info with username, and now we need to make a call to our users model, the same function, but we need to specify a different column. Instead of email, we're going to specify username, and then the value that they passed in for that input field. Over in our users model, we'll add our constant up here, username. Then we'll copy our if statement from up here in our validate email, and we'll say if a user already exists with that username in the database, you need to enter a new username. Or if the form helper is valid username does not check out, in our case, the username just has to be 4 characters long, then we're still going to mark it as false. Over in our form helper model, we're going to create our is valid username. Username is coming in, and we're going to do some regex here, making sure that the username we passed in is 4 characters long. After our username, we have our first name. They validate form name. First name. And after the first name, we have our last name. We're going to use the same validate function for both of these because we're validating them both the same way. If there's something entered in the field, it's valid. If there's not, then it's invalid. So we'll create our validate form name down here. Our form element array is coming in. And we're going to set our form element is valid to our form helper model, which is going to determine if the name is valid or not. I'm going to pass along the value from our form element. Hopping over to our form helper is valid name. Name's coming in, and the return here is simple. We're going to say if name, return true, else return false. After our last name comes our password. Validate form password. Pass along our password array, and then we're going to set up our validate form password function. And here we're going to call our form helper is valid password function. on our form element value. Over in our form helper, we're going to set up our isValidPassword function. Takes in a password, and the requirements for a password is that it has to be at least 8 characters long. Inside of our form helper, we're going to define a constant up here, password min length. Set that to 8. Now down in our isValidPassword function, we can check our password to make sure that it's at least 8 characters long. And we have a simple one-line return statement, just checking to see if the length of our password is less than the min length, then we have to return false. Otherwise, return true. Then the last input on our form is our confirm password. Validate form confirm password. Here we're going to pass along 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be our confirm password. That's our confirm password array. And then we're going to pass in our password array. Set up our confirm password down here. Validate confirm password. We have our confirm password form element, and then we have our form element password. And we're going to define our flag for our form element confirm password. First, we're going to check to make sure that the password is valid. Our form element password is a valid password. And then we can check our confirm password form element, the value, and make sure that it equals our form element password value. So we're going to check to make sure the password's valid and the password matches the confirmed password. We're going to return true to this isValid flag right here. Otherwise, if either of these fails, this will get set to false. And then we have to set our message, and it looks like we have to set our messages for a few of these validations that we missed, and we're just going to set these all the same way. So for our confirm password, our message, we're checking to see if the form element is valid. If it is, the message is nothing. Otherwise, it's going to be password invalid. Copy that up here as well to the validate form password. We're going to pass along the same error message there. Then for our name, we'll create a name invalid message. Same for our username invalid message as well. Over in our form helper, we're just going to create the error message for each of these. Username, password invalid, and name invalid. Back in our validate signup form, we have went over each of the form elements submitted by the user and validated them on the back end. Now we're going to set the form is valid flag, which is saying, is the entire form valid or is the entire form invalid? So if any of these inputs are marked as invalid, even if there's just one that's invalid, the whole form will get marked as invalid. In our form data that's getting passed in, form is valid flag, we're going to update that here on the back end now according to our back end checks. We're going to call this form helper model is form valid. We're going to pass along all of the form data. Now in our form helper model, we're going to set up our is valid form. We have all of our form data coming in. We're going to do a simple one-line return statement right here. What this return statement is checking is our form data form elements is valid flag. We're creating an array of the is valids from each of the form elements. And then we're checking to see if false is in that array. If false is anywhere in that array, meaning if any form element is valid is set to false, we are going to return false. Form is not valid. If we don't find a false in any of those form elements, we're going to return true. And that is our validate signup form function. We have validated the form data, and we have marked the form is valid flag for the entire form. So what we're going to do now is check that up here in our user function. We're going to say if form data form is valid, then all is good, and we can insert the user into the database. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything, and we're just going to return the form data. And our form data here that we're returning will be updated because we went through and validated it through this validate function here, but we have to make sure it's passed by reference, of course. That way it will get updated. So now, if we find a user that already exists, or a username that already exists in the database, it will get updated to false, even if it was coming through the front end as true. And it will be returned as false up here. Skipping over the if statement where we're going to insert our user into the database, because that will only happen if the form is valid. Now we need to update the signup form UI based on the response from the server. So we're going to run the data we got back from the server through our signup form helper, and we're going to create a validate response data function. In our form helper, under our get post data function here, we'll define our validate response data function. We're going to go ahead and get our self equals this. Then we're going to get our self.form is valid, and we're going to set that to the response we're getting from the server. This function is coming in with the response from the server data.form is valid. Which remember we set over here in our validate signup form right here. So now this form is valid flag has been updated here on the front end to the response from the server. Then we're going to update our self.form elements, and we're going to place the entire front end form elements object with the response we got back from the server. Now all of our form elements on the front end contain the values that got updated here on our back end in each of our validate functions. Then we're going to return a boolean, and we're going to call our form helper validate function. And so into our validate function, we're going to pass a server string, meaning we want to validate the server data and update the UI based off of the server data and not based off of the front end data. For example, the email address to the front end might look good because the front end is only validating the structure of the email address. The back end is validating the structure, but it is also looking for a user in the database with that email address. So the front end could mark the email address as valid, while the back end is marking the email address as invalid. Now we're going to update our validate function to take in a parameter called from. Where are we validating the data from? Are we validating it from the front end, or are we validating it against the response we got from the server? We'll begin with our form is valid flag. We only want to assume true if it's a front end check. So we're going to say front end equals from, then we're going to assume true. And if we're validating it against the server, we just want to use whatever value the server gave us. Self.form is valid. Because the self.form is valid got set right here with our response data. Now our self.form is valid is set from the server. Then we'll loop over each of the elements. We'll get the element by the class name. That doesn't change at all based off if we're checking the front end or the server. Then we have the value. If we're coming from the front end, we want to get the actual value that's in the input field on the front end. Otherwise, we're going to get the value from the server, which is in the form element that we're on, the dot value. Because again, we set the form elements to be the updated form elements from the server response. Then to check if the form elements is valid or not, on the front end, we want to validate the input based off of the input element on the page, but if it's coming from the server, we want to use the server is valid value from that form element. We're also going to do the front end check on our message. If it's front end check, we're going to get the attribute data message. Otherwise, we're going to use our message that we got from the server for that form element. Then we're going to set our message based off of the is valid flag. If it's valid, the message is an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to leave the message alone. And now our validate function is able to validate strictly from the front end or validate based off of data coming from the server. Now back in our signup script, signup_form.validate, we need to pass in our string front end. Now we're validating the front end whenever the user clicks the sign up button. When we validate that, we're going to go ahead and make our ajax call here. We'll hit our URL, pass along our params, and in our onReady state change, the request from the server, we're checking our ready state here. This should be ready state. And our request status, making sure that those are good and done. Then we're going to call our success function here, pass along our data right here. If everything is good, we're going to alert valid. If it's not, we're going to alert not valid. We're going to go ahead and refresh our page. First, we'll click on our sign up button. Everything is marked invalid and the error messages are displayed. You'll notice that these alerts didn't go off. The ajax call didn't even go off because we're only checking the front end and the front end check failed, so we didn't make an ajax call. Let's go ahead and fill out the form and we're going to click sign up. And look at that, our alert went off, which means the form is valid on the front end, so we went ahead and we made that call to the server, as you see right here in the network tab. Our response came back from the server in our JSON payload here. Our whole form is marked as true, which means each of these form elements also got marked as true. And since it was true, in our success function here, we validated the response data again. This time we validated it server side, and it all checked out. Now we're just going to do a little quick check to make sure that this validate response data is updating the UI correctly if we get a non-valid response. To do this, we're just going to hop over to our signup model, and we're going to just return false for the email all the time. So in our validate form user's email, we're just going to set this to false. Now the backend will never validate to true, and so even though the front end thinks that the email is valid, the backend is going to say the email is not valid, and so we still should see the UI update accordingly on the front end when the data comes back from the server. Let's clear out our network tab and click sign up. Now you see it's not valid. We still made the request to the server because the front end said email is a valid structure. Let's send it to the back end. In our network tab, our user's endpoint, we see the response here. The form is valid is now marked as false. If we expand our form elements here, expand the email object, you see that our email is valid has been set to false because we just set it to return false all the time. Let's go ahead and click OK and scroll up to the top here. We have our border, but we're missing our message. This is because we forgot to also set a message when we were tricking the system into always returning false. So here, let's say email invalid from server. So now this is the message that should pop up if we hit this again. Click sign up. Again, we're going to get not valid. Now if we expand our user's response, our email message is no longer empty, but now it contains the message that we just updated on the server side. Click OK and scroll up. Now the error message from the server is displayed on the front end along with our red border. Let's revert that back to how it should be for validating the form's user email. Click sign up and all is valid. And that is going to wrap up our sign up form server-side validation. We have taken our sign up form values from the front end, passed them to the server, validated them on the server, and then passed that response back to the front end and updated the UI accordingly. In the next video, over in our sign up model, we will be inserting the user into the database if the form is marked as valid inside this if statement right here. And that is going to wrap up Hello World episode 14, sign up form backend validation. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys learned something. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment down below, and let me know what you want to see coded up next. I'll catch you later.